Welcome to Career Explore Northwest Live. My name is Tina Swanek, and I'm the Career Explore Northwest Live producer for KSPS PBS Public Television here in Spokane. Thank you all for joining us today. And Career Explore Live, just real quickly, is an interactive Zoom event that connects young people with professionals so they can learn about careers and career paths. And today we're going to be exploring the career of a wildlife biologist with the help of our special guest, Bart George of the Kalispel Tribe of Indians. Bart is the Wildlife Program Manager for the Kalispel Tribe and has been a wildlife biologist for the tribe, for 14 years. He works on various projects, including wildlife habitat enhancement, endangered species management, and cougar research. Bart chose to pursue this career because he's passionate about wildlife, the enhancement of wildlife habitat, management of wildlife challenges, and the human elements of natural resource management. So hello, Bart. Thank you so much for being here today to share some information about your career with our student guests.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is great.
And also joining us today are students in the Veterinary Assisting Program at New Tech Prep with instructor Kim Coleman, and students from East Valley High School with Future Ready Coordinator David Rovick. Thank you all for being with us today and participating in this event. Before we get started with the main portion of our event, I want to quickly share the agenda. First, Bart will tell us a little bit about his career and educational journeys, and then we'll open the floor to questions from our student guests. All right, let's get started with our event. Again, welcome, Bart. Would you mind sharing a little about your education and career journeys with us?
Yeah, you bet. I've been with the Kalispel Tribe for 14 years now. Started as their wildlife biologist, and then about 3 years ago moved into the wildlife program manager position. Before that, I was working in Northeast Washington with the Pend County Public Utility District as their wildlife biologist and working on habitat mitigation and enhancement projects along the Pend River. So that sort of habitat and construction and stuff like that fit really well with the tribe's needs on their mitigation program. Before moving to the Northwest, grew up in Iowa, so kind of farm country, no mountains, not that much wildlife, but grew up on a farm, had some wildlife around, took a keen interest in sort of thing and the outdoors, and I got my undergraduate degree from a small school in central Iowa called Simpson College. My undergrad's in environmental science with a biology option. And then once I started my career, I started with the tribe, I said 14 years ago. I enrolled with the University of Idaho in their master's program and got a Master of Natural Resources, focusing on wildland restoration and then also the human element of wildlife management. So kind of a different path. I took about 6 or 7 years away from college after my undergrad before pursuing a master's degree, but it worked out really nicely for me to be able to apply some of my professional experience already into that educational component.
Great. Well, thank you for that overview. And Bart is currently situated in his office, which is north of Newport. I mentioned earlier to him when we were chatting, this is the environment he gets to work in every day, and I'm quite jealous. So thank you so much for that overview. And I'm sure the students have a lot of questions for you. So we'll go ahead and move into the question and answer portion of our session. And again, we won't be taking questions through chat. We're going to start with a question from New Tech, and then we'll grab a question from East Valley High School, and then we'll continue with that order throughout our event. So New Tech, what is your first question for Bart?
Yeah. What is the weirdest thing that you have seen while working in your field?
That's a fun question. I could go there. I see a million weird things in the field, which is what I like. I can't even think of the course of my career. I've seen so many. I can tell you recently we've had a few weird things. We had I came to work, Tina mentioned we work north of Newport on an 800-acre wildlife area here. It's remote. There's like not that much around. Across the road from us is a hayfield that we manage for our buffalo, and like I said, there's like no neighbors. You can't really see any other homes or anything. And as I pulled into work, there was a humongous pig that, by all appearances, looked wild, walking across our driveway of our wildlife site, which that was weird. And that was kind of a fun thing to have to deal with first thing in the morning. Aside from that, like we just have weird sort of wildlife encounters and different things all the time. We came to work last summer and there was bear prints on the window of our office. Last night I got a trail camera picture of a cougar carrying a cub about 300 yards from where I'm sitting right now, just over to my right. So weird things are happening all the time. And this is it's sort of a dynamic landscape, and that's kind of one of the things I like about it. It's a little bit unexpected.
So interesting. Okay, East Valley.
Did you get a master's by choice or was that necessary for your field?
That's a good question. A little bit of both. You don't have to have a master's degree to work in wildlife biology. Typically, a Bachelor of Science is a requirement, and a master's degree, some positions is going to require that. Mine didn't. I wanted to pursue that just sort of for my own growth, kind of build in some areas that I knew I wanted to sort of focus on in my career. So it wasn't a requirement. My employer certainly encouraged it and supported it. I think it has helped me, but no, you can get into the field with a bachelor's degree for sure.
Hey, New Tech, next question.
My question is, what is the hardest part of your job?
I think like with any science job, it's just keeping pace with developments and things that people are learning. You have to stay up to speed with ongoing research. You have to know, kind of what's the cutting edge for technology, the most useful tools available and things like that. It's easy, especially, now I've been in the field for 20 years to kind of stick with what you know and what you're comfortable with. But as technology advances, as science advances, as, our sort of knowledge and understanding of things, to keep up to speed. So, we're constantly reading and staying up to date on the latest science, latest technology, and what folks are doing that's working for them. I think that's been kind of the hardest thing, is just sort of growing with the field.
East Valley High School, next question.
Was it hard to find organizations to work for after you graduated?
Yeah, it was. It's a competitive field to get into. There's a lot of folks doing kind of the work we're doing, sort of the spirit of the thing. There's NGOs, so non-government organizations, there's county organizations and state and federal, the whole host of different agency folks doing sort of similar work. And then of course, lots of tribes, particularly in the Northwest, doing a lot of wildlife work. So there are options, but I think it's important to sort of find one that suits you, that, a wildlife biologist covers a whole suite of different things. There's wildlife biologists that sit in office and review permit applications and make sure that there's not going to be negative impacts to species or habitats. There's wildlife biologists that are flying around in helicopters and mugging bighorn sheep and stuff like that in the mountains. So this whole, range of things you can do. And I think it's important, if you want to get into the field, to kind of have a sense of what your interests are, what your skills are, what you're, capable of, and, sort of find an employer based on that, or find a position based on that anyway.
New Tech.
Have you always wanted to be a wildlife biologist? If not, what other careers have you considered?
Yeah, I've known most of my life I wanted to get into wildlife biology or management of some sort. It's an interesting thing. Like I said, I grew up on a farm, also worked construction and things like that, all through high school and college. So I've kind of got that sort of background with farming and with construction, which actually works really well with the habitat work we do. A lot of what we're doing involves, construction, like hard work, using heavy equipment, excavators and skid loaders and tractors and things like that. And that was all something that I was pretty comfortable with, having been around it most of my life anyway. So to find that sort of position where you're using your wildlife skill set, trying to create habitat through, construction and essentially farming, was a lucky break. So I guess if I had to go into another field, it would probably be construction or farming. But hopefully I'll be here for a bit.
East Valley, next question.
What does job growth look like?
I guess I'll start like job growth getting into the field. It's probably going to start volunteering and then moving into like a tech position. A lot of times, I started working as a park ranger, summer park ranger in Iowa, just to get into the natural resources field, and then moved into natural resources specialist and things like that, spraying noxious weeds and cutting trees or whatever. So I guess the sort of natural progression would be, volunteer, technician, into a professional biologist position, and then eventually later into managing a group of biologists or a group of technicians, something like that. Once you get to that point, you spend a lot more time at your desk and doing emails and things like that. So that's kind of the progression of a career in natural resources from what I've seen.
UTech, next question.
You have a specific species you enjoy working with the most?
Yeah, for sure. Cougars are sort of my species that I love and care about and try to focus a ton of energy on. I've just always been fascinated by big cats. Cougars are, the biggest cat we've got in North America. So spent a lot of time with them, both professionally and then also personally. I have dogs that pursue them and tree them, and all the equipment to tranquilize and dart and collar and research those. So yeah, I'd say cougars are sort of number one. But we manage a whole host of other things. We have a leopard frog project going on right now. We study bats, we study grouse, of course, deer, elk, and moose and things like that that are important for folks that want to eat them. But the one that I guess if I had to pick one to work on maybe the rest of my career would be cougars.
East Valley, next question.
Do you have to deal with a lot of office time, or do you feel like it's pretty balanced?
There's a lot of office time, but it is balanced. I mean, look at where our office is. We're lucky in that way. I do better sort of in an outdoor or field setting, at least a portion of the day. It's just better for me to get out and get some fresh air every day. I probably wouldn't do well in a, big expansive office with cubicles and things like that. And I know that about myself. So again, I kind of found this role or this position that fits sort of my strengths. But the office time, certainly an important part. We have, we have to be communicating via email. We have to be looking at, whatever data we have coming across our computers every day. So yeah, there's definitely an office component. And I think the balance is what you make it,
What has been your journey to becoming a wildlife biologist?
Sort of the progression that I talked about earlier is pretty close, right? Started as a summer position as a park ranger, right? Like working the night shift, telling people to take down their clotheslines and campgrounds and things like that. But that's where you start. You just got to get your foot in the door somewhere. And from there, you're making contacts and, sort of building this resume and this experience. I worked for the military. I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers back in Iowa. I'm not a military member, but they hire civilians for this sort of roles. From there, I was able to transfer within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers from a project in Iowa. It's actually a flood control project that had a big recreation component, campgrounds and things like that, to a wildlife project on the Columbia River. Chief Joseph Dam down in central Washington is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project. They had a wildlife mitigation requirement from Congress. And my first sort of professional full-time job out of college was working on the Columbia River, taking a boat every morning. I get on a boat and boat up the Columbia and work on these wildlife sites that were only accessible from the water. I worked there for a few years before coming to the Pend Oreille County PUD, who was working on a hydropower license similar to what the congressional mandate for mitigation was for the Corps of Engineers. So the PUD had this requirement for wildlife habitat mitigation. I had a little bit of experience with it already and was able to transition from that job then to the tribe, who was doing sort of similar work in the same region. So kind of that same step, like I said, from a volunteer, from a helper, whatever, to a technician, to a biologist, now to a manager.
How long did it take from being a volunteer to working in wildlife management?
I mean, I've been at it for almost 20 years now, so it takes some time. Just depends on your, what your aspirations are, right? Where there's places that you can do that much more quickly. And then there's other folks that they don't want to do that. You know, we have a lot of people that want to be a technician for their whole career. And the technicians are kind of the ones that get to have the fun, right? When I was talking about what you can do in the field, the ones jumping out of helicopters on top of bighorn sheep and elk and stuff like that are a lot of the technicians. So, yeah, it can take any amount of time, right? And there's people that never want to make that transition, and there's people that kind of rush into it and end up, you know, in management roles pretty early in their career. But I would guess most of, you know, from the time you graduate or get, you know, start your professional career, it's going to take you a few years to move into those management roles, just building experience and making contacts, and then just sort of moving up the chain.
New tech, next question.
What life skills have you found especially useful for your current career?
I'm lucky, like for wildlife, the wildlife portion is easy, right? Like I'm passionate about wildlife, and that's just a real obvious fit for me. I think some of the skills that people might not recognize being important, like just people skills. There's such a big human element to wildlife management. I have to be able to talk to neighbors or landowners or people experiencing, you know, wildlife depredations where, you know, their pets or livestock are getting attacked. We're talking to neighbors when we're doing a project and we're gonna, you know, be building a dam or a dike or something like that, and they might have impacts to their property. So having to have those sort of conversations with folks, and having, you know, the ability to just sort of reach out and have those conversations. And I think the kind of people skills sort of thing has been a surprise and a bit of a surprise need, I guess, and been a really important one that a lot of people might not consider. You think you're going to be out in the field, you know, handling wildlife all the time, and that's not really the case. You need to have some technical ability. You need to be able to do all the things you need to on a computer and program wildlife collars or surveying, all these different things. So yeah, I can't just point to one, but yeah, if I had to, I'd say just being able to talk to people and get the information you need and relay the information that they need effectively.
East Valley, next question.
What's your least favorite species to work with?
There actually is a species we've sort of avoided, that I've avoided also, is wolves. They're very controversial. I like wolves, like it's not against wolves. We love them. But they're just such a sort of hot topic, and people have big emotions around them, and everybody seems to have a really strong opinion. And, you know, sort of our opinion and my professional opinion is, you know, they're another piece of wildlife out here on the landscape. They manage them appropriately without all that sort of emotional strings attached. So we don't do much with wolves, and I haven't done anything with insects. I haven't done, you know, I've done some bird surveys and different things like that, but kind of the little teeny tiny ones, and then also the big toothy ones are the ones that I've avoided.
Hey, new tech.
With your current education experience, what other career options are available to you?
Well, I mentioned, I touched on it, I guess, but I wouldn't probably want to work outside of natural resources. I just like working on habitat and working with wildlife species and working outside. So I don't, you know, if I had to make a career change, it would be still probably in the same sort of field. That might mean construction, but you know, construction on wetland mitigation or building wetlands or working on different things like that, tree planting. So it wouldn't be a huge departure necessarily from what I'm doing now with the skill set. People with sort of my education and background go into consulting sometimes. So they work for somebody that's, let's say the highway department is building a road just going to cross a wetland. They're going to hire a consulting firm then to come out and look at that and assess the losses and develop a plan to mitigate those lost habitat. So there's a lot of people that do that kind of thing after, you know, even after retirement from an agency, they'll go into that sort of work. But if I had to choose one, it would probably be in something like construction and sort of using my background, using my skills on wildlife needs and habitat to apply that into, you know, habitat restoration, enhancement, things like that.
East Valley, next question.
What can a high school student do to prepare themselves for this career?
Volunteer for sure. The best thing you can do is reach out to any group around and find out if there's something you can do. If it's building trails, if it's planting trees, you know, litter collection along the Spokane River, whatever those sort of groups are doing, the tribes are doing, the departments are doing, getting out and getting in front of them and, you know, building that relationship. And I think also just making sure that it's something you want to do for the rest of your career, right? Is the most important thing you can do. As a high school student, you're probably going to have a hard time finding, you know, a job or a position, but they do exist. That opportunity exists. Volunteering is the best way to get into the field and make sure it's something you want to be. And there's a million opportunities to do that. So I'd strongly suggest that.
I might just mention we are out in kind of a remote area, so that's why there might be a little bit of freezing occasionally during this event, just because of our connectivity out there. Okay, New Tech, next question.
What has been your biggest challenge so far in your career and how did you adapt to that situation?
My biggest challenge has been moving from that sort of field biologist position into a management position. So moving from, you know, field-based kind of working in the field almost every day, you know, gathering data, doing sort of the sciencey things that you might imagine a wildlife biologist doing, moving into that management position where now I'm helping wildlife biologists do that and providing them the tools and, you know, doing all the sort of administrative things. So that's been a difficult transition, I guess. It's been about years. The way to get over that is, you know, approach that with an open mind, recognize what your role is and recognize how that role has changed and kind of harken back to when, you know, when I was a biologist, what were these folks doing to support me and how can I sort of replicate that for staff and make sure that they have what they need. So, you know, accept mentorship, recognize that there's people in the field that have been there for a long time that have a lot to offer, listen to what they have to say, you know, listen to what the folks that you're managing have to say and different things like that, and then kind of put it all together and put your own spice on it and own it. So that's what I'm working on to continue to grow in my role and make sure I'm doing a good job for the tribe and for my employees.
East Valley, next question.
What's your least favorite part of your job?
I don't know. I mean, I'm lucky I don't have that's not an easy question. I like my job. Probably all of the admin stuff, like, you know, timesheets, payroll, making sure the bills are paid and the power bills are paid and everything's working as it should. That's sort of the boring stuff, but it's the important stuff that kind of happens behind the scenes. And that's the stuff nobody loves that, but it's important. So that's probably my least favorite.
New Tech.
What is the most interesting thing you've discovered while working on tribal lands?
I mean, as far as like an actual discovery, we've found all sorts of different artifacts and things like that that are fascinating, right? It's not my area of expertise, but it's always fascinating to find that and have an archaeologist come on site and sort of explain to you what they see and what's happening. And I have such a keen eye for that stuff. That's just such a different skill set than I've got. I always think that's really, really interesting. You know, as far as like wildlife stuff and stuff that I found in my role or my job, yeah, we find cool stuff all the time. I don't know, where we just found this week a carnivorous plant that's kind of a weird thing on one of our new properties, something a lot of people don't even know exists in this region. So we're always discovering new things and kind of seeing fun things out there. As far as the most interesting, it's hard to put my finger on one. It's something different every day.
East Valley, next question.
What motivates you the most?
I mean, I'm just passionate about wildlife and habitat and, you know, the outdoors. So this is just a really natural fit for me. I think my motivation comes from getting out on a site and, you know, whatever work we're doing, you might work on a wetland for a month, and when it's done, you know, you come back the following spring and there's, you know, 300 ducks out using this marsh that you built, and that's so rewarding. I think that's probably the motivation, is like seeing the fruits of your labor out there in the form of wildlife or trees growing or whatever it might be. So that's sort of my motivation. I just really care about the outdoors, and I like seeing, wildlife. I like seeing people out enjoying it. We have the site that we're on here is a Indian Creek Community Forest. It's open to the public, and that it's 800 acres with trails and things like that. And it's really nice to see folks come out here that maybe don't get to work in the woods and see it and experience it every day like we do, to come out and enjoy this. Is maybe see deer and elk while they're hiking. It's really rewarding. That's probably my primary motivation.
New Tech, next question.
What steps do you feel are needed to better educate the public about interacting with wildlife?
That's a good question. That's something that wildlife managers are sort of just kind of getting up to speed on right now, I think, is different methods of outreach. Social media is such a new thing. Like for me, a lot of you folks probably grew up with social media, but I didn't. And a lot of agencies didn't. And a lot of the agency managers are folks, my age or older, that are still a little bit unfamiliar, a little bit wary about social media. So I think that outreach is probably the most important way to get the message in front of lots of people. Certainly, events like this, getting yourself on the news or in a newspaper or whatever like that is great. But I really think the emergence of sort of social media as an outreach tool has been a huge thing, and something that people are just finally kind of starting to understand the power of and the value of.
East Valley.
What are some new trends or issues in wildlife and habitat management?
Of course, you're going to ask that question after I said how important it was to stay up to speed on all the new trends. It's the new technology. Like I said, there's always new technology coming out. And I think, when I started my career, like GIS and GPS stuff was really becoming the powerful tool. And now we've transitioned to different modeling technology and, AI and different things like that to, basically plug in information that we have and generate, recommendations or reports, or even population estimates. So the trend that we're seeing sort of developing right now is the use of, like I said, new software, basically AI or whatever modeling software in wildlife management, and it helps sort of inform those decisions. The nuts and bolts of the thing remains the same. AI doesn't build a wetland for you, or doesn't start an excavator and go dig a hole for you, but it can certainly help you inform what hole should we dig, how deep should it be, what are the slopes, how much organic matter do you need for XYZ species, that sort of thing. So this collection of information that we have available now to create useful models for the field is really new and really useful.
Hey, New Tech.
Are you performing any DNA testing on water to track species coming through a specific area?
We do a little bit. It's not something I have a lot of experience with. We've done that with particularly amphibians. I mentioned a leopard frog project that we have in the Kalispell Valley. So we call that eDNA, so environmental DNA. We extract water samples and test that, basically just a presence absence for us though. So we're identifying what species are present, and we're looking for particularly leopard frogs. They're an endangered species in our state. So we do a little bit of that. The fisheries department has a much more robust eDNA sampling program in the streams. So they're doing a lot more of that. But the wildlife side, there are some applications for that, for gathering, gather the snow underneath of a track to make a positive identification through genetic sampling. We don't do that much of it, but that technology does exist.
East Valley.
What does an average day on your job look like?
There is no such thing as an average day, which is one of the things I love about it. We have just so many things going on and different projects, and there's no average day. we work, I can say that we typically work 4 10s. So I work 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Typically check into the office first thing in the morning and, figure out who's doing what and where people are headed. But we might be in meetings all day. We might be in, trainings all day. But, starting later this month, we're going to be doing grouse surveys and, all hands on deck. We'll be up at 3 a.m. and in the woods, an hour before daylight, listening for grouse drumming. We just do a whole host of different things, and it really suits, sort of my personality. I wouldn't do a factory doing the same thing every day, or on an assembly line, sort of doing the same process every day. I really like that sort of variety to my day. There is no typical day.
Okay, new tech.
Does your scope of work include reestablishing migratory paths?
It is something that we are trying to do all the time. So when we purchase property for wildlife mitigation, that's a main consideration is, how is it connected to other property, and what's the connectivity like to big open space and whatever sort of habitat these animals need. So it's on our mind a lot, and it's sort of a primary factor in our decisions as far as habitat protection and development and purchase and things like that. We also work on that some with, big species that move around in the landscape. We partner with groups out of Montana and Idaho for grizzly bear recovery in the Selkirks, and that's something we're always looking at, is how are these animals moving across the landscape for, genetic exchange. And then also is there a safe place for them to get across the highway or across a river valley or train tracks or whatever it might be. We're still working on the caribou project up in Canada, and that's a major encumbrance to their recovery, is big linear developments, basically highways and big power line easements and things like that, where snowmobiles and four-wheelers and different sort of recreational activity exists. So we're always looking at how animals move across the landscape. There's opportunities for genetic exchange. If there's connectivity to big, intact, protected habitat, it's really important.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. East Valley High School.
Starting out, what's an average salary look like?
Average salary, I don't know what it translates into, like a salary per year. Right now, like when we hire somebody straight out of college, they would expect to probably be around $22 or $23 an hour on a 40-hour work week. So whatever that looks like. And that's a job with good benefits and a retirement plan and sort of all the things, healthcare, which is expensive. So somewhere in that range starting out. And then, obviously the higher up you go, the kind of more money you make.
Thank you. Bart, there's just one last question for you. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our student guest today about wildlife biology careers that maybe wasn't addressed during the Q&A portion of our event?
No, I mean, I think I would really sort of stress and drive home the point that, there are myriad options in wildlife biology. Like if you're really keen to work on computers and things like that, there is a wildlife job for you, and you can, model and do different things. There's a position for a whole. So if it's something you're interested in, if wildlife is something you're passionate in, but maybe don't feel like you want to have some, wild job out in the woods, like there's a place for you. If you're somebody that's maybe not so great with computers and technology and things like that, probably still a place for you somewhere in habitat and wildlife and something like that professionally. Yeah, like it's just a really broad field with lots of opportunities and some really cool ones.
Great. Thank you so much, Bart. I think we're getting to the end of today's event. We have just a couple more minutes. And so I'd like to quickly, once again, thank you, Bart, George from the Kalispel Tribe of Indians, for taking time to visit with us today. And we really appreciate all the information that you shared with us, your career journey, some tips about what students can do to get kind of started down this pathway if they're interested, some of your daily work. It's been incredibly informative. And I'd also like to thank our schools that joined us today, I'd like to thank Kim Coleman and the students from New Tech Prep Veterinary Assisting Program. And I know, Bart, you interact with veterinarians fairly regularly as well. So, and then David Rovick and the students from East Valley High School for participating in today's event. And we hope you all found this session to be very interesting and very informative, and that you sort of gleaned from today's event the information that you need to make a good decision about whether careers in wildlife biology are the right path for you.